Yeah, so it's lovely to see everyone again this morning. We're going to carry on looking at the book of 2 Samuel. And this week we're looking at chapter 7. So if you want to find those in your Bible, that'd be brilliant. There's a few verses that we're going to be looking at over the course of the morning. So if people are happy to read and stuff, like as we get to readings, yeah, you're always very good at doing that anyway. So yeah, so that would be great. So just a little bit of a recap where we've been and what we've read so far. So the last few studies we've seen how King David has been very successful, hasn't he, in his battles, how God has been with him and won these battles for him. It hasn't been David, has it? It's been the Lord that has done that for him. And we've seen how David has really trusted God. We see that throughout, don't we? The way that he's trusted God to win those battles every step of the way. And then last time we looked at this book, we looked at the Ark of the Covenant arriving in Jerusalem. So that's a brief overview over all the things that we've looked at the last few weeks, but just a little bit of a reminder. So as I said, today we're going to be looking at 2 Samuel chapter 7. And we're just going to, today we're going to look at just the first 17 verses. I was going to do the whole chapter, but I think as I started to look through it, I felt it was better that we just spend a bit of time on one little section. So this is what we're going to do this week, and then we'll continue with the next bit next week. So if somebody's happy to read 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 1 to 17, then that would be great if I've got a volunteer for that. So 2 Samuel 7.
I can do that.
Oh, numerous people. Right. Julie, do you want to do that? And then there'll be plenty of time for everyone to read. So Julie, if you could do that, that'd be lovely. So 2 Samuel 7 verses 1 to 17. Thank you.
It's headed God's promise to David. After the king was settled in his palace and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies around him, he said to Nathan the prophet, "Here I am, living in a house of cedar, while the ark of God remains in a tent." Nathan replied to the king, "Whatever you have in mind, go ahead and do it, for the Lord is with you." But that night the word of the Lord came to Nathan, saying, "Go and tell my servant David, this is what the Lord says. Are you the one to build me a house to dwell in? I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought the Israelites up out of Egypt to this day. I have been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling. Wherever I have moved with all the Israelites, did I ever say to any of their rulers, whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, 'Why have you not built me a house of cedar?' Now then, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture, from tending the flock, and appointed you ruler over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I've cut off all your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men on earth. And I will provide a place for my people Israel, and will plant them so they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore, as they did at the beginning, and have done ever since the time I appointed leaders over my people Israel. I will also give you rest from all your enemies. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, with floggings inflicted by human hands. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever." Nathan reported to David all the words of this entire revelation.
Thank you. Oh, I'm just going to let Leslie in. Right, there we go. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Julie, for doing that. So for reading that to us. Yeah, so just cast your eyes on that passage as we go through. Looking at verse 1, when we look at verse 1, what has God now given to David? Looking at verse 1, what is he now given to David?
Rest from all his enemies.
Yeah.
Just you.
Yeah.
Haven't got-
Yeah, so he's given him rest from his enemies. So I feel like this passage, or this chapter, the whole of the chapter, I feel it's almost like a little bit of an oasis. It's you know, before we've seen all of this conflict, all of this fighting, this bloodshed, all this kind of quite dramatic stuff going on with David and his enemies, and this has gone on for a long time, but now there just seems to be a little bit of an oasis as we read through this passage. And God has given David rest, and I think this is rest that he has needed. Why is it important, do you think, that God has given this rest to David? Any thoughts as to why this could be important, that David has this rest at this point?
So he's got time to think about something else, perhaps.
Absolutely. So it gives him time to think about something else, which we'll see what he thinks about in a minute. I also wondered where, you know, where else in the Bible does it talk about the importance of rest and a place where God gives rest?
Genesis.
Genesis, yeah, brilliant.
At the beginning.
Yeah, at the beginning, wasn't it? Because God had created the world, but after God had created the world, God rested, didn't he? And from this, we have the Sabbath day, a day when God's people would rest, and that's where, and God, you know, it's important that there is this time of rest. That's why God has given that time of rest and to his people. And I think this is where we find David at the moment, isn't, you know, he's been busy, he's been fighting his enemies, but now God has given him this rest. And I mean, we see as go on that maybe this rest is a little bit short-lived, you know, and we'll see that as we continue through the book. But at this moment in time, God has given him this little oasis, this opportunity to rest and to consider. So as Joyce mentioned, so he gives David the opportunity to perhaps reflect and to think about things. So what are his thoughts then, sort of, what does he then think about? What does he then reflect on in verse 2?
He's got a lovely house.
He has a lovely house.
and God's ark remains in a tent.
Yeah, so it seems that he's given this opportunity to think and reflect, and he thinks about the fact that he's living in this house of cedar, but the ark of God remains in a tent. Yeah, so he's perhaps, or you maybe get the impression he's almost a bit embarrassed about this, you know, oh dear, you know, I've got this lovely house, and you know, the ark of God is only in a mere tent, and perhaps he's a bit embarrassed about this, and he wants to resolve the situation, doesn't he? He wants to do something, something about this, because he is concerned about this. So who does he go to speak to about this issue?
Nathan
the prophet.
Yeah, Nathan the prophet. He goes to speak to Nathan the prophet, obviously a man of God. And just reading a little bit between the lines, looking at verse 3, what do we learn about Nathan's thoughts of David and who David is, and how does Nathan think about David? What are his thoughts about David, do you think, looking at that verse, reading between the lines slightly?
he trusts him, doesn't he? And he knows he's got the heart for God. So he's just saying, whatever you have in mind, go ahead and do it. He doesn't even question him to say, what is it? Let me, you know, tell me, and then I'll tell you whether I think it's a good thing to do. He just trusts him, like,
Yeah.
you know. get on with it, basically. Whatever you have in mind, I know what you're going to do is going to be for the good.
Yeah, definitely. I think he does have that trust for David, which obviously David has won that trust by the way that he's led his people and the way he's trusted in God. So, yeah. So, yeah, it says, yeah, for who is with him? Who's with David?
Lord.
The Lord, yeah. So Nathan's really trusting of David, and he acknowledges that it's the Lord is with David. So he's quite happy, it seems, for David to make the decision that he wants. As you say, he's not saying, "Oh, run the ideas by me." He's saying, you know, do what you want. Really, go ahead with that. Yeah, so David, it seems he wants to do what's right in the eyes of the Lord, doesn't he? He's concerned about this issue with the fact that the ark is living in the tent at the moment. He wants to show respect respect to God, and in that, by putting the ark in a place where he thinks it should be, in maybe a house of cedar. He wants to rectify this situation and put it right. And so this is what David's thinking about. He wants to provide something. He wants to provide the right suitable accommodation, I suppose, for this ark of God.
Can
But
I say something?
yes.
I find it interesting at that point where David always inquired of the Lord, and he inquired to Nathan what to do rather than God, and I think that reflects in what occurred later.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, you're right. He sort of inquires of the Lord. He's actually gone to Nathan at this point to ask what he thinks. Yeah. No, that's interesting. Thank you for that, Hazel. So I think there is a but here. So David's wanting to give something to God, to provide something for God. But I think as we continue to read this passage that we've got here, David is reminded that it's not it's not his job to provide for God, but it's the complete opposite. It is God who will provide for David. So he's concerned here. He wants to provide for God, but God is saying, as we read through, that actually it is God who will provide for David. So we're going to look at this provision that God gives to David. So it's a provision from God, not David. So as we look at verse 5, God asks the question, "Are you the one to build me a house to dwell in?" So he's sort of questioning David here, isn't he? As to, is he the person that should be providing this house? You know, he's kind of asking David that question, making David think about whether it's his job to provide this place for him to dwell in. So he asked this question. So for bonus points, who does eventually build the temple? Solomon. Yeah. So we see later on that it's actually David's son Solomon that does build a temple. But at this point, he's saying, are you the one to build a temple? He's asking David this question, questioning David. So what does he then remind David of in verse 6? So verse 6 says, "I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought the Israelites out of Egypt to this day. I have been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling place." So what does he remind David of in verse 6?
That he's been with them all the way, and wherever they've gone, he was in a tent.
Yeah, absolutely. So so basically,
in other words, the tent has been sufficient for him.
Yeah. The tent hasn't been an issue, has it? It doesn't seem to have been a problem. Absolutely right. So he's reminded that ever since they left Egypt, they've moved from place to place. The ark of God has lived in a tent. He reminds David of this. Obviously, David knows this, but he's trying to help David understand that it is God that will provide for David. So what does God then ask David in verse 7? What's the question there? Or what's he questioning David at that point?
Why hasn't he built a house before of cedar?
So he's saying there, isn't he? Let me read it again, that verse 7. Wherever I have moved with all the Israelites, did I ever say to any of their rulers, whom I commanded the shepherd, my people Israel, why have you not built me a house of cedar? So he's saying there, isn't he, that actually, oh, I've got 2 people in the waiting room. Let me just let them in. Oh, okay. Right, I'll let them back in. There we go. Let me get rid of that. Sorry, distracted here. Not very good at multitasking. So he's saying here, isn't he? You know, have I ever asked anybody, why have you not built me a house of cedar? Have I ever questioned? Have I ever asked for that? Oh, I'm just going to. So he's questioning, like, have I ever asked for that? And what, you know, the answer is basically no, isn't it? It's like a rhetorical question, I suppose, isn't it? I'm just going to quickly. So he said, I've never asked for this, have I? I've never asked to build a house Caesar. As Leslie has said, that the tent has been sufficient, hasn't it? And he's questioning David, have I ever asked you to do this? Have I asked anybody else to do this? No, he hasn't, has he? He hasn't asked anybody. So, as far as God is concerned, it seems that it doesn't matter that the Ark of God is dwelling in a tent. He says that God has never asked David or anyone else to provide a place of cedar for him. The important thing is, which is me mentioned again, is that so I got distracted by the waiting room again. The important thing here is that God has been with his people throughout history. And I think that's the important thing, isn't it? It's not where that Ark of God has been. The important thing has been that God has been with his people throughout history. That is what is important, not actually where it sits. So, so the king may have a palace. So David's got this wonderful house of cedar, as he mentions at the beginning, but it's God that lives among his people, and that's what's important. And then eventually, as we've already said, Solomon will build a temple. But it's interesting, there's something that Solomon reminds us, and we're going to read a couple of verses here. I'll read the first one because it's only one verse, but if I can, so the first one is from 1 Kings 8, verse 27. So I'll read that one because it's a very quick one. If someone else can look up Acts chapter 7, verses 48 to 49, that would be great. So I'll read the first one. So 1 Kings 8, verse 27, this is what Solomon said. But will God really dwell on earth? The heavens, even the highest heaven, cannot contain you. How much less this temple I have built. So even though Solomon at this point is building this temple for the Ark of God, he's acknowledging there that it's not the temple cannot contain God, but actually God is everywhere. God is with his people. It's not the temple that will contain him. So has somebody got Acts chapter 7, verses 48 to 49?
Yeah, I have.
Yeah, if you could read that, that'd be lovely. Thank you.
48 to 49. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
7, yeah. However, the Most High does not live in houses made by men, as the prophet says, heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool. What kind of house will you build for me, says the Lord? Or where will my resting place be?
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. So there again, we're reminded that that a temple, a building, houses made by human hands cannot contain God. But where is God? He's in heaven, isn't he? On his throne, and the earth is his footstool. So he's bigger than than a temple or a tent. That's not where he is. He's actually with his people. He's actually in control, complete control of everything, isn't he? We're reminded, aren't we, that God is not confined to a temple or a building, but he's with his people and he's in heaven on the throne. So, okay, yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah,
Carol.
yes, Andrew.
When God gave the instructions to the people to build the tabernacle, the tents, it wasn't for God's purpose, it was for the people so that they would see that God was with them. And because God is everywhere, that's quite true. But in his mercy, it was to say to the people, look, this is an outward sign that I am with you. And I think, therefore, it's absolutely true. God is everywhere. But in his mercy, he showed them that I am with you in a physical way.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful, isn't it? Because they needed that reminder, didn't they? That God was with them. So, yeah, no, that's brilliant. Thank you, Joy. Yeah, brilliant. But as we read on, God doesn't just leave it there, does he? What does he remind David of in verses 8 and 9? So the first part of, 8 and then the first part of verse 9. What is David reminded of here?
What God has done for him.
Yeah. So, and what has God done for him?
Took him away from being a shepherd and appointed him as a ruler over Israel.
Yeah, so it's gone from being that shepherd boy to being the ruler over God's people. Yeah, and even though, David wasn't in line, was he, to become king, but God has made him king, hasn't he? That sort of shepherd boy to king. So, yeah.
He was the most unlikely person to be chosen, wasn't he? Even Samuel didn't believe it, did he?
Yeah, when he went down through all the other brothers. And then there was little David, although I'm not sure that he was little, but yeah, he was just a shepherd boy, wasn't he? So he was the sort of unlikely one of all his brothers.
Wasn't it years later, Carol, that it was said of David that he was he was a man after God's own heart?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I don't know, whereabouts did he say? Whereabouts does that come up? Does anyone
It's
know?
somewhere in Acts
Way
20,
further on, I think.
something like that.
Yeah, so yeah, a man after God's own heart. So,
And yet, look what he did.
yeah, well, yeah.
He committed adultery.
Oh, we haven't come to that yet, Joyce. We don't want
Exactly, I
spoilers.
know.
That's spoilers.
But it just reminds you that he was not perfect.
Precisely, yeah. I mean, we've seen so far, haven't we, that he is he's looking to God, isn't he? He's depending on God, he's trusting God. But yeah, we do obviously, as time goes on, see that he is a human being, which of course he is. And he makes mistakes, isn't he? So yeah, so but yeah, so God reminds him that he was a shepherd boy, and now he's the ruler over God's people, and God has appointed him to do that. What else does he say in these verses 8 to 9? Beginning of verse 9, what we told there?
I have been with you wherever you have gone.
Yeah, that's right.
And I've cut off all your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men on earth. It's very reassuring. God is with him. He's not abandoned him in any way. No,
that's brilliant, isn't it? He's reminding David that he's been with him wherever he has gone. Yeah, which is great. So God has always been with David. Yeah, and then as you said, Margaret, God's rescued David and his people from their enemies, which we've seen over and over again, haven't we, the past few weeks. So Yeah, so we're seeing here, aren't we, that God has provided for David. At the beginning of this, we're seeing David trying to provide this this perhaps house of cedar or whatever. He's concerned about God remaining in the tent. But he is saying here that God has provided for David. And God will provide for David and his people. And we see this in the next few verses. You know, he looks back at David's life and shows him or reminds him where he's provided for him there. But now he's looking to David's future, looking at verses 10 and 11. So what does God promise here for David's future, looking at verses 10 and 11? You can just shout some of those things out.
You'll be remembered forever.
You're remembered forever. Okay, yeah.
You provide a place for the
give
people.
them a permanent place to stay instead of moving around all the time.
Yeah, so provide a place. Yeah.
Wicked people
they'll not
will
be-
not oppress them anymore.
Sorry, what was that? Was that? Yeah, I don't know who that was.
Wicked people shall not oppress them anymore.
Yeah, yeah. So wicked people will not oppress them anymore. Yeah. Yeah.
They can rest from their enemies.
Rest from their enemies, yeah, yeah. So which is, I think they're getting that little bit of rest here at the minute, aren't they? But yeah, he's promised this rest from their enemies. So yeah, it says that, and yeah, that he will make David's name great. Where have we got that? Make his name great. So, oh yes, at the end of verse 9, now I will make your name great. And how great? Well, greater than the greatest men on earth. So that's pretty great, isn't it? So he's going to make his name great.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty big, isn't it? So he's going to provide a place for his people, a home of their own, and he will give them peace. And men will not oppress them anymore. That's what we've got written here. And I just thought it might be quite useful to remind ourselves why this oppression started. So in verse 11, what have we got here? He says here, if you look at verse 11, and have done so, this oppression, and have done so ever since the time I appointed leaders over my people Israel. So I was thinking it might be good to remind ourselves kind of what happened way back in 1 Samuel when they started to appoint Israel's first king. I don't know if anyone can remember what happened when they decided to appoint the first king of Israel.
God wasn't very happy about them having a king because it sort of took away, glory from God himself. That was one of the things.
Definitely, and I think that's right. They it wasn't really what God wanted, but it's what the people wanted. So I wondered if we could just refresh our memories on that, because when we looked at 1 Samuel, it was a while ago, just to remind ourselves of that. So I thought actually, because you then get the whole picture, if we could read the whole of 1 Samuel 8, if someone's happy to read the whole of that. So it's verses 1 to 22. I don't know if that is the whole of 1 Samuel, but 1 Samuel 8, verses 1 to 22. If anybody would be happy to read that, just to remind us of what happened. Who was that? Leslie. Brilliant. Thank you, Leslie. So 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 1 to 22.
Yes, I've got it. When Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as judges for Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah, and they served at Beersheba. But his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations had." But when they said, "Give us a king to lead us," this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord, and the Lord told him, listen to all the people, what all the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king, as they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. So they are doing to you. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly, and let them know what the king who will reign over them will do. Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, this is what the king who will reign over you will do. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants. Your manservants and maidservants and the best of your cattle and donkeys he will take for his own use. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, and the Lord will not answer you in that day. But the people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they said, we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us and to go out before us and fight our battles. When Samuel heard all that the people said, he repeated it before the Lord. The Lord answered, listen to them and give them a king. Then Samuel said to the men of Israel, everyone go back to his town.
Thank you, Leslie. Yeah, that's just a little reminder of what happens way back in 1 Samuel. The fact that the people hadn't understood or hadn't trusted God, had they, that he would provide for them. So they very much took things into their own hands, and they wanted a king, even though God had warned them of the consequences of having a king. They still wanted a king because they weren't trusting God that God would provide. So since then, there's been all these repercussions and these problems and these hardships. As a result, wicked people will have been oppressing them, haven't they? Because they have not trusted in God. God had provided for him up until then with the judges, hadn't he? But they'd stopped trusting God, and they wanted to do things their way. And these were the consequences, that there's these conflicts between and this oppression as well. So yeah, so who will establish, or who will provide a house for David?
The Lord.
The Lord, yes. Again, it's coming back to God, isn't it? It's the Lord who will provide a house for David. David's focus, as we've seen, has been seeing what he can do for God. And in a sense, that's good. But actually, God has turned David's perspective on its head. And now it's not about what David can do for God, but it's what God has done for David, and God will continue to do for David. It is God who provides. And I think that is such an important thing for us to remember, that it is the Lord that provides for us as well. But God doesn't leave it there. There's more to come. He continues to tell David how he will provide for his people. Even after David's demise, and there's some quite exciting stuff, I think, as we read this. As I read through these next few verses from 12 to 16, I was questioning who was he talking to, who was he talking about at this point. So I think, to refresh us, if somebody could read verses 12 to 16, or the last part of 11 to 16, and then we'll just unpack those verses for a few minutes. If someone's happy to do that, read verses 12 to 16.
12.
or the end part of 11 of chapter 7.
Okay, I will if you like.
Oh, thank you, Joyce.
Right. The ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite for 3 months, and the Lord blessed him.
Sorry, Joyce, we're in chapter 7. Sorry, 2 Samuel chapter 7.
Oh, so we are. Sorry, yeah. And what verse was it?
From verse 12, please. Thank you.
Right. Sorry, I was on the wrong page.
That's all right.
When your days are over and you rest with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you. You will come from your own body, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. How far do you want me to go?
Yeah, to 16, please, Joyce.
Right. When he does wrong, I will punish him with the rod of men, with floggings inflicted by men. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever.
Thank you, Joyce. Thank you. So when you read through that, do you think, is David talking, is God talking here about David's offspring as a nation, or is he talking about a specific person? Do you have thoughts on that? Because when I read through, I sort of went from one thing to the next in my head. Any thoughts as you read through that? You may not have. Sorry.
I think it's a combination of both, because Solomon would build the temple, but God was saying that, you know, through the nation of Israel would come the Almighty King, the one and only King. So I think it's a combination of both.
Yeah, no, I think that was my conclusion as well, Joy, because I kept thinking, oh, it sounds like a nation, it sounds like an individual, it sounds like a nation. So we're going to unpack this just for the next few minutes, just so we can see a little bit of that. So in verse 12, we've got, it mentions David's ancestors, isn't here? And who are some of, or there's one particular person that comes to my mind when I think of David's ancestors. Any ideas, like, you know, who are these ancestors?
Well, Solomon to start with.
So so the previous people before David, I was thinking.
Abraham.
Abraham, yes, I'm glad you said Abraham. It's exactly the person I was thinking of. So so I was thinking about these ancestors. So so he says that when your days are over, you will rest with your ancestors. So he's mentioned the ancestors there. And I just thought it'd be really useful to sort of just think about Abraham for a few minutes. Can somebody read Genesis chapter 13 and verses 15 to 16? And these are the promises that were given to Abraham. So Genesis chapter 13, 15 to 16. If someone could read that out, that would be great.
Shall I do that then?
Yes, that'd be lovely. Thank you.
All the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted.
Thank you, Sue. So there we are talking about his offspring. We're talking about many people, aren't we? Plural. We're talking about many people, his offspring. There'll be many of them. And then if somebody could read Galatians chapter 3, verse 16. I'll tell you what, I'll read that. I'll read that actually, because it saves you. It's only one person. Unless someone else has got it. No? Okay, I'll read it. So Galatians 3 verse 16 says, the promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed. Scripture does not say and to seeds, meaning many people, but and to your seed, meaning one person who is Christ. So this kind of again illustrates the whole kind of mingling of they're talking about Abraham and the nation, but actually when he's talking about in Galatians here, talking about his seed, he's meaning one person. Who is who? Who's that one person?
Jesus.
Jesus, yeah. So, and I think this is what we've got, as Joy says, in this 2 Samuel passage. I think we've got the mingling of two. We've got the whole of a nation that God's talking about here, but obviously we're talking about one person as well. So as Joy has mentioned, it was Solomon that was and it may be that verse 12 or verse 13 here is referring to Solomon building the temple. But then on the other hand, who was said to he was going to raise the temple in 3 days? Jesus. So
Jesus.
yeah, so I think we have got you know, and as we all know, that you know that who was going to be born from David's line? It's the promised Messiah. It was going to be Jesus. Yeah. So I think we have got the two things going on here. We've got the nation as a whole, but we've got this this individual person, this Messiah, this Jesus here being talked about as well. And it says in verse 14, the individual kings, they may be condemned in verse 14, but the line will continue, and it will continue through exile. And then finally, it will come to a point where we see an announcement to a young girl by the angel Gabriel. And if someone could read Luke chapter 1, verses 31 to 33, this is the announcement that we have here. So we've got this whole line of David, and it leads to this point when there's this announcement from the angel Gabriel. So if someone could read Luke chapter 1, verses 31 to 33.
Yeah, I will.
Yes, thank you.
You will be with child and give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever. His kingdom will never end.
Thank you. Yeah, so we've got these promises here, haven't we? This angel Gabriel appears to Mary, and it says here, doesn't it? The Lord God will give him a throne of his father David, and he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever. And this is what we've got again in this 2 Samuel passage, haven't we? That his reign will be, or his throne will be established forever. And we see this, and it's established through Jesus, isn't it? It will last forever. And we see that being fulfilled there. And when we read this passage in 2 Samuel, it's again, it's kind of pointing to Jesus, isn't it? Pointing to this promised Messiah. So it's not what David could do for and provide for God, but it's what God provides for him. And that reminder that he's promised this Messiah. Jesus will come from his line, and Jesus will be the one to establish his throne forever. I feel like we've rushed through this morning. Like I'm so pleased I didn't decide to do the whole thing, because there's so much more that we could look at here. But I think just reminding ourselves of the promises that were given to David, the fact that David was concerned about what he could give to and provide for God, but God says, no, actually, David, this is what I've provided for you, and this is what I will continue to provide for you in the future, and I will provide somebody much greater who will, his throne will be established forever, and that is Jesus, an eternal throne. So yeah, so it feels a bit rushed, but I think we probably get to draw it to a close. So just to remind ourselves that God provides for us too. He provided for David, but he also provides for us. And just say, I think it's really important that we serve God, but it's also really important that we lean on God, I think, because he is the one that provides for us. He is the one that gives us what we need. Just as David, he won those battles, he won those wars because of God, because of what God was doing. The same thing in our lives. It's God that leads us, it's God that provides, and I think it's really important to remind ourselves of that as well. So yeah, so next week we're going to look at the next bit. Joy is going to take us through that, and we're going to look at David's prayer in response to what God has spoken to him. So so over to Zoe, who's going to take us through the prayer time now, if that's okay, Zoe.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Sharon.